Now that we are now that we've completed the interviews for your communication research project, we need to talk about what you do with them. Hopefully you have a good set of data to work with, but what do you do with it? All right, so I said, hopefully you have completed your interviews. Now, I usually work with long interviews, which are the 20 to 60-minute interviews. And if you are in Comm 499, I would ask you to have between 8 and 12 to complete a full project. If you're in Communication 300, however, I'm going to let you have between 3 to 5 interviews for a preliminary project that's not quite as full as you would need for COM 499. All right, so you have your interviews. Stage one of this process is to read or watch all of your interviews. Now, probably you were there for all of them. You probably asked questions or you observed them in most cases, and that's not enough. You need to now watch them again. And I want you to come to them without any preconceptions of what you're going to find. I don't want you to be using your memory, what you think you're going to see. I want you to come to it as if you were watching it for the first time. And I want you to read or watch all of the interviews in one sitting. So the fact that you did an interview a couple days or a couple weeks ago, that's not good enough. You have to see all of the videos, read all of the interviews at the same time because you need to start seeing them in a different way than when you were observing the original interview. So that's stage one. Watch or read all of the interviews in one shot. Stage two is taking notes. You need to begin to take notes about each interview after you've watched them all or read them all one time. Then you're going to come back to them and read it again, watch it again, and start taking very careful notes. What is it that strikes you as you're listening or reading this interview? What do you find significant? What jumps out at you as being really interesting? And this is subjective. This is what impacts you. Now, what types of things might you be looking for? You might be taking notes on things that are expected. So when people answered questions as with the types of things that are expected, you can note that. And when somebody mentions something that's unexpected, you can make a note of that. If they repeat an idea, make a note of that. If they come with an answer, an idea that just you're like, what? Okay, take a note of that. You're going to systematically mark the text. So go through and make notes throughout. And I usually, if I have a transcript of an interview, I usually just write directly on that page, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. But you're going to systematically mark up the text to indicate what the chunks of information are about. So what's the theme or what's the cluster of like information that you're finding here? So that's important. And in the end, I just want to warn you, you're going to have many more notes and themes than you will actually use in your project. Now, here's an example of notes that might be done. So we have notes to the side, just handwritten things that jump out, and maybe a highlighter, color coding things, possibly. That might be getting a little too type A for some, and that's okay. If you just take notes in the margin, that's cool. That's all you need to do. And at this point, you're just being creative as you're taking the notes. There is nothing in particular that we're looking for. It's just whatever strikes you. And your motive is very abstract right now. You're not looking for something in particular. You're just looking for something notable, so something worthy of writing notes. So let me give you a more concrete example. This is from a research project that a set of students did a few years ago called Voices and Violence. It's about women who left physically violent relationships with a romantic partner. We had, I don't know, somewhere between 8 and 10 interviews, and then the students analyzed these, and they had a grant. They took this to a conference, and it was published, so it was a pretty cool project. But this is looking at a small bit of a transcript from one of the interviews in which they'd asked the woman to speak about her relationship. And so in this case, we have the first thing highlighted. My mom and my dad, they thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And to the right, a little note that says, family likes him. So that's just something that jumped out at me as I read this. I thought that was interesting that that her family liked the man. Then a little bit down lower, I have highlighted Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and to the left, I wrote Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, because that's interesting. It's a movie character, and it just jumped out as being something significant. Then next, he told me I couldn't leave the hotel, and he took my car keys. And so to the right, the little note is that he controls her. At this point, as I'm doing this type of notes, I really don't know what's going to end up in a paper, but some of the stuff might end up in there. Some of it might not. We did have one student who did take the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde idea and did find this throughout many of the interviews that there was something that switched in many of the men, that during the dating period they were much nicer, and after marriage often the more violent side came out. And so this was the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde was a theme that did recur, and it eventually made it into part of the published paper. The idea that the family likes him, gotta tell you, that didn't make it into the final paper. But when you're first looking at these interviews, you don't know. Is this going to be a common theme? Does a man often woo the family as well? And we didn't know, so it was worthy taking a note of. But in the end, it didn't make it. So the note taking, you end up with tons and tons of notes. Stage 3 is to start to sift through all the notes and make some decisions about only taking the information that has a theme to it that are repeated in many of the interviews. So in the case of the one I was just mentioning, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, was an idea that many of the women in the interviews actually stated. They actually used that term, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and that was one that they decided to use that theme in particular. And that meant other themes are going to be ignored. So in this case, the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, you'd go back through each of the interviews and mark every instance where this theme is mentioned or alluded to in some way in the interviews. And many of these, it was about the very literal Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Other times it wasn't literal. It didn't mention Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, but it alluded to a swift and sudden change in the abuser's personality. And so that can be coded as well. So you choose some themes that you want to look at in each of the interviews. We examine each interview again, because you may have missed it the first one or two times you go through the interviews, that don't always catch it. And so it's easy to catch the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde because they use that specific word. It wasn't as easy the first time or two times through the interview to catch where somebody alludes to a sudden shift in personality. But as you go through the interviews again, suddenly it will go, oh, you know what? This actually has to do with my theme as well. Now you are going to have to limit which themes you're going to code, because if you've been taking notes, you have possibly hundreds of notes throughout these interviews, and that's way too many. I usually suggest that you're going to narrow down to 2 to 4 themes that you're going to code in these papers. So you're just going to, after reading them, taking the notes, find what are those 2 to 4 themes that are throughout each of these interviews that I'm going to be writing my paper on. So in another case with this Voices in Violence project, a student wanted, after doing all the notes, she was really interested in the responses that women had about why they left the relationship. What was it that actually made them leave? Not just think about leaving, but actually get their feet out the door and go. And so she began coding for what were exit themes. How did the women decide to exit? And she found a number of reasons why the women exited, and that's all that she coded for in this particular student's paper. That's all she wrote about is why the women left. And so she had tons of other great notes, but they weren't going to be discussed, only the things about why the women left for her paper. I had 3 students who were working on this set of data, by the way, so I'll talk about different themes that different students decided to explore. All right, so you will choose the themes, you narrow it down to 2 to 4, and recognize that your choice of themes to deal with will be subjective. It is your choice. What appeals to you? What do you think is interesting? What do you think is worthy of being explored? And ignore all those notes you made that don't fit into the chosen themes. So it's a necessary part of the process to have to go through all the notes, so that you are actually reading the interviews closely or watching them closely. But on the other hand, you can't do, you just have to go through that process, but you can't use most of it. It's heartbreaking, but true. All right, that's stage 3. Stage 4, we're going to go on to an organization of the coding. I make a chart of every response to the themes. So, in the case of the exit themes, I'll have a chart that gives out what are the major reasons why women leave according to these interviews. And I am going to basically copy and paste every time one of my interview subjects mentions why she left. And so I just copy and paste this into a chart so I can organize it and see what are these different reasons of why she left. Now, I like to just mention that when you're copy and pasting, it's a good idea to make a note about who said this thing, such as Stephanie Rose, line 46, so that you can easily go back and find what it was that that you're mentioning here. So I'll give you an example here from the student paper of Voices in Violence. So she found that the number one reason that these interview subjects left was fear of injury. And she then charted each of the examples. So the first one, he kind of flipped out on me and he choked me and slapped me and he almost killed me. He choked me so bad I could hardly breathe, and stupid me, I left for a little while. That was said by Mary Lou. I don't have the line number there, but that wouldn't be a bad idea to say what line it was. The next, Mary Lou also said, he slung me up against the wall, ripped my sweater shirt off me, took a fork and jabbed himself in the leg. I told him he needed to leave. He ended up leaving because I did call the cops that time. Then our third quote, I got a death threat by email. I would literally be afraid at night that I was going to get killed, and would be threatened in subtle ways with butcher knives because one of my phobias are knives. I got a present as butcher knives. So these kinds of things terrified me. So finally I got away when he was away. It's from Rose, and that's who's also known as Stephanie. By the way, we switched names throughout this process. Both Rose and Stephanie were pseudonyms, but she ended up choosing that she wanted one or the other. I can't remember which one she wanted, so we switched her name. So anyways, this is just an example that this student pulled out all the quotes that talked about a fear of injuries, of being why they left. And so you're going to organize 2 to 4 themes that way, so that you have 2 to 4 themes and that you pull out quotes that support these themes. And this will become the outline for your paper. And to give you an example, this is the part of the paper that that student ended up with, in which he says the most common motive for the exit responses in this study is the battered woman's fear of injury or death. In the instances outlined below, the battered women leave permanently only when they fear death as opposed to injury. Interviewee Mary Lou describes the first instance in which she leaves her abusive husband, and then it lists the different quotes, giving some information between them. So that's what happens in that final written paper. Now, stage 5. describing the connection between the themes. So you have somewhere between 2 to 4 themes. How are they connected? Which one is the most important theme? And I'd like you to begin your paper with your strongest point. And so in this example of the student who is dealing with the exit themes, this was her kind of introduction paragraph, was which helps connect the themes that she's going to talk about. A content analysis of the data reveals a pattern of reasons driving the responses of the battered women in this study. The woman will stay in the relationship as long as it is worthwhile for her, but will leave once her investment in the relationship begins to fail. Fear, detachment, support systems, and anger are the predominant reasons that these women exit their abusive relationships. Okay, so that's that connection in stage 5, that we connect these different themes. Then comes stage 6. You are now going to be writing the paper. You are going to use the themes and quotes as your main points for the paper. You'll need to discuss and analyze the themes and quotes. So you'll have it organized that you'll have your 2 to 4 main themes. You'll introduce what they are, such as these exit themes. Give all of the examples from your interviews. And then I have an example from the student's paper, and then in the highlighted are my comments to her. So she begins this section of the paper saying, when second interviewee Stephanie exited her relationship, she explained, da 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 da. So finally, I got away when he was away. And at that point, the student had just stopped the paper. And my note to her was to give an analysis here in your own words. Perhaps something like, Stephanie endured blank and stayed, but when she received concrete confirmation, it made her realize the threat was real. And in the end, what she ended up with, I have on the second page what the student actually wrote for her little piece of analysis. So what the student wrote was, Stephanie endures both verbal and physical abuse, but it is not until she receives death threats that she fears for her life and makes the decision to leave. And so the analysis is there. It's not long, it's not complicated, it's not in-depth, but it is there. Now, one little note for my Comm 300 students, you are not writing a full paper. You are actually putting together a PowerPoint presentation that will lead us through these points. And so I want you to have practice with the interviews and with doing the note-taking, the coding, the getting the themes together, and then you'll present those themes in the PowerPoint format as opposed to having to write a full paper.